All right, hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about the self as Judith Butler studies it in Bodies That Matter. I'm especially interested in materiality and its construction. Gender is the tensive point that Judith Butler decides to use to interrogate the selfhood. Her 1988 essay explicitly connects the feminist thought of the day with the dangers of an over-essentialized or even strategically essentialized gendered self. I'll talk about this more in a minute, but right now I'm interested in what kind of self gets pulled from the ashes of this post-structuralist discourse, so to say, and whether that self is essentially the same thing as the post-structuralist discourse, and whether that's a good thing, if not, and what those possibilities might be. The title, La Personne Possible, please excuse my French, is a reference to my favorite philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who had this idea of selfhood as l'homme possible, the possible man. Now, I want to see if there's any room for a possible person from Butler's reading, since she really doesn't think that we can get anywhere good by hyper-glamorizing or hyper-affirming femininity. For example, something I thought of while I studied this was the resurgence of New Age feminism that upholds the idea of like a divine, super special feminine in the attempts to like make it something worth associating with. Now, the opposite of this super affirmation is the down and out, overdetermined self, which we kind of dipped our toes into last week with Foucault's analysis of the self as it's constituted through power discourses. This is interesting, but not somewhere I personally want to end up, and that might be a flaw of mine, maybe not. But in this presentation, I want to try to examine and see if there are opportunities for a possible person, even one whose very materiality is constructed and discursive, as Judith Butler says. So Bodies That Matter is a 1993 book that was published in response to gender trouble, wherein the famous theory of performativity was expanded. Gender trouble was, in its own right, a response to Butler's 1988 paper, Performative Acts, and Gender Constitution, which was one of the required readings for this week. Needless to say, Butler's writings on gender have been very influential. For example, I've included this somewhat cursed, somewhat iconic fanzine that was made by grad students in response. Judith Butler is also directly responded to by Pope Benedict XVI in one of his encyclicals, because I think that's pretty cool. I hope to be told off by the Pope someday, even if it's because I'm contradicting ancient dogma that threatens its integrity. I think that's pretty cool. In Bodies That Matter, Judith Butler interrogates deeper the concept of gender performativity. Now, this is the idea from her 1988 essay that gender is something that is ritualized, performed, externalized, and thus not a stable identity or a locus of agency. She says, gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. It must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. Now, there's a bad reading of this performativity analysis. This involves the idea of gender as a costume, something you can pick up out of the closet, put on in the morning, and then take off at the end of the day. This assumes both a discardable or being able to get rid of the parts of gender that you don't like, and unfortunately it also assumes a real aspect, element, something that you can put the gender on top of, and then that remains kind of okay when you take it off. However, this isn't accurate, and Bodies That Matter really dives deeply into why. It looks at the instance of materiality that is the alleged real thing that picks gender up and puts it back on. Butler comes to the conclusion that this is constructed. This is a very scary and overwhelming endeavor. For example, Butler in the introduction talks about having to connect it to herself and remind herself that she's talking about bodies like her own, that she represents as the informal Judy that she knows herself. However, the conclusion that Butler comes to within the essay of Bodies That Matter is that the sexed specificity of the body itself is discursive and constructed. And by that, I mean she uses an example of Henri Carré, again, excuse my French, to give an example of how, in the Western philosophical discourse, the concept of the sex-specific feminine is built on a fallacy, or at least a really flawed reading of the idea of Platonic material. And I'll explain more in the next slide. But overall, she seems to be warning, in true post-structuralist fashion, that the separation of gender and sex aren't really as discrete as one would think. So Butler looks at the role of matter in Plato and Aristotle and throughout the rest of the philosophical canon. Aristotle described matter as something that was bound up in the form that it took and the role it performed. For example, wood gets shaped into a ship. The cause and effect are both wrapped up into this matter, the matter and the schema, or that which can be said about it, like, for example, in biology where you have classification. Aristotle thought that this classification, as well as the matter that makes it up, both constituted the thing in and of itself. Now, Foucault interprets this as in a bad and scary way. He sees a one-to-one relationship between the person and the thing that constitutes it, pretty much. He sees power, punishment, discipline, repression, discourse as conferring subjecthood onto a person. Now, this isn't the good kind of subjecthood, but more a person who is subject to and materialized through oppressive regimes. Now, Butler wants to ask if there are different types of matter. She says modalities of matter. Not ones that get subsumed into the power relationships of Foucault, but ones that have to be excluded from that by their very definition of existence. She does this by turning to Plato. Now, Plato's Greek name, Platon, means rock, and comes from his very short and beefy stature. Apparently he was a very good wrestler. Yet he is known as the father of Western philosophy for famously privileging the forms in which matter participates. That is not the literal rock, but the rock which exists in the immaterial world, of which this is the imperfect copy. And this is despite or maybe because of being shaped like a rock himself. Either way, the philosopher Henri Carré attempts to argue that the form and matter distinction that Plato makes creates a binary opposition, and that the language that Plato uses to describe this type of generative relationship between thing and non-thing is gendered. She thinks that the female matter is opposite to the masculine form, but it appears via catachresis, or an inferior copy of the masculine, within a phallocentric or male-dominated episteme. For Henri, it seems, what is excluded from this binary is also produced by it in the mode of exclusion and has no separable or fully independent existence as an absolute outside. A constitutive or relative outside is, of course, composed of a set of exclusions that are nevertheless internal to that system as its own non-mathemizable necessity. It emerges within the system as incoherence, disruption, and a threat to its own systematicity. That's Jen Butler on Henri Carré. So, through Plato's explanation, Butler says, the feminine is set up as a thing that can never be fully articulated, except kind of as a receiving ground for the generative principle of these male forms. And as a result, it only semi-exists as kind of like a frozen cast that's stuck outside the form and matter that gets co-opted for generative purposes of these things which are allowed to somewhat participate in the forms. But this generative space itself never gets allowed to participate. Julia Kristeva embraces this freezing out with her analysis of the chora, or the womb space, as a generative space, and she connects it to the semiotic realm before the structural imposition of language. She says, the mother's body is therefore what mediates the symbolic law, organizing social relations, and becomes the ordering principle of the semiotic chora. On the other hand, Irigaray rejects this co-option and undertakes what Butler calls a radical mimesis. Mimesis is a Platonic term that means copying something that's an original. Butler says, I will mime and repeat the gestures of your operation until this emergence of the outside within the system calls into question its systematic closure and its pretension to be self-grounding. Butler thinks that this is an example of citationality, but not as the enslavement or the simple reiteration of the original, she says, but as an insubordination that appears to take place within the very terms of the original, and calls into question the power of origination that Plato tries to claim for himself. This radical mimesis allows for a rupture from within which new possibilities are allowed, such as this critical mime. By co-opting the discourse from the position of a voice that isn't supposed to exist or have any generative power of its own, Irigaray is playing the game by its own rules in order to expose the fact that the idea of matter is constructed and can thus be deconstructed via such a co-option. Butler questions further whether these critical mimesises are successful at creating new articulations within the old discourse, or whether they just provide an example within that framework. And we're going to talk about that paradox coming up. But at the very least, Butler is arguably able to show how to disrupt and question the original idea of matter, of Platonic matter. And she shows the contradictions within it that allow for readings like Irigaray's to break it open and expose these inconsistencies. Butler's hoping to do the same with gender and examine the articulations and critical livings and gestures and bodies and genders which have been deemed unacceptable to the hegemonic matrix of heterosexuality. Bodies That Matter then goes on to discuss concrete examples of articulations and how these articulations get shaped, classified, and forbidden. Now, the idea of the in and exclusion both constituting each other, this has reminded me of Jacques Derrida's idea of the outside text. There is no outside text, where language is so full of these slippages or deferrals of meaning that they just endlessly circle around to themselves. So kind of in the same vein, there is no outside gender. There is no stable original of the performances that we're all emulating or participating in. And this has the effect, arguably, of destabilizing the whole big gender thing that we're a part of. And I wanted to show this quote that begins the essay of Bodies That Matter, because I wanted to show that Butler understands the interpretive aspect of deconstruction, the reconstruction that comes after. There's this idea of loving deconstruction, or criticizing something or critiquing something because you want it to be better. Obviously, if you come roaring in with your own ideas and your own agenda, that's not going to have the best effect. But at the same time, I think there's openness, and that's what this quote at the beginning is referring to. It is useful to interrogate and to question and to pull apart and deconstruct gender. And we're going to see why in the next couple slides. All right, so this nuanced critique is really great because, first of all, we have a more detailed analysis of what Butler is talking about by gender performativity. the very idea of material matter itself is not as stable as we might think. So that's cool. I also understand a little bit better Professor Crawford's original summary of Butler that I've heard from other classes. Gender is a copy of which there is no original. Now, what does this mean for selfhood? Butler shows an understanding of an interpretive function to deconstruct the self through this quote about usefulness. But what do you build in that wake? What future possibilities exist in that wake? So, Butler's analysis of selfhood as discursively and materially constituted allows for these types of radical ruptures within the matrix of constitution. Now, the limits of that materiality we see through the bodies and genders that are considered unintelligible and inarticulable. But by examining these, we also see that the greater structure of the material basis of gender get ripped apart from the inside out. They get articulated when they're not even supposed to be articulated in the first place. It reminds me of the opposite of the Wittgenstein quote, who at the end of the Tractatus said, "What we can't speak of, we must pass over in silence." Blasphemy quoting an analytic in a Butler slideshow, I know. But what I'm trying to say is, what happens for those articulations that are not considered articulations? I know there are all kinds of examples of violence perpetrated against queerness, against transness, the erasure and negation that attempts to nullify these articulations. I think they're detailed very well in Foucault. Butler's conclusions suggest that these type of tensions are indicative of the internal collapsing of the structure, which seeks to uphold this hegemony. But as long as the dominant understandings of sex and gender prevail, we still do have these articulations as marginalized and outside. And this is a problem, especially when the stakes are so high. Alright, so I read this paper by Halsema, who saw a similarity between Ricoeur's analysis of the subject and Butler's post-structuralist reconstruction of the idea of gender. Paul Ricoeur has this idea called distanciation. It's the idea that the self that interprets or understands itself isn't the same as the thing that it tries to understand. In his study, we see this is the text read by the reader for literary criticism, or even for the life text that's lived by the person living it in phenomenology. This separation between person and thing that it tries to understand is helpful because it opens up a realm of possibilities that are allowed through this slippage. Now, according to Halsema, Butler is especially interested in the ways that discourse releases terms from their fixed reference, opening them up and making them the site of resignification. Ricoeur also studies the dialectics between alienating distanciation and participatory belonging, and he answers Butler's claim that the subject is produced by the discourse, and also puts it under critique, thereby questioning its own conditions for existence. Now, for Ricoeur, this is not a problem precisely because the self does not coincide with the text that it refers to and uses for the articulation of who it is. This is by Halsema. Now, my question is, what do you think of Butler's construction of gender and of materiality, especially the hegemony, which is threatening to hold us all together? Does this worry you, or does it create new possibilities of articulation? And if so, what do these look like? And secondly, do you think the idea of distanciation in the life text help, hurt, undermine, are compatible with Butler's arguments at all? I'm really excited to talk about this because for me, I understand like the different ways that these are related, but I'm really excited to flesh out and see if there are any inconsistencies or different ways of looking at things that I haven't talked about yet. Oh, and also I wanted to include this sick screenshot of Judith Butler and Donna Haraway vibing in a hot tub in Santa Cruz because I mean, yeah, that's great. That's iconic. So yeah, after this it's just the works cited, and I'm really excited to talk with you guys about this in class. Thank you so much for listening.